Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. It had been hours on the road, the endless stretches of highway melting into one long blur. The tires hummed beneath me like a lullaby, the rhythmic sound almost lulling me to sleep. I hadn't planned to stop, but the exhaustion had begun to crawl under my skin, gnawing at me. The weight of the drive, the fatigue that came with it, had made me long for even the slightest relief. And then I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, barely visible through the heavy fog that had crept in like some unseen predator. A sign, faint, glowing, almost otherworldly, hung in the mist, like a beacon calling me forward. Hollow Pines Hotel. I squinted at the sign, unsure if it was some trick of my tired eyes, but it was real, solid, too real to ignore. Hollow Pines Hotel. The thought of a warm bed, a quiet room, and the peace of a night free from the endless road was too tempting to pass up. I veered off the highway, tires crunching on the gravel as I made my way toward the hotel, the fog thickening around me like some heavy, suffocating blanket. The further I drove, the stranger the feeling in my gut became. Something about the place seemed off. The air was colder here. A biting chill that had nothing to do with the time of year. It clung to me, seeping into my bones as I approached the hotel, its towering form slowly revealing itself through the mist. The Hollow Pines Hotel rose from the ground like a forgotten monument. Its stone facade was aged, worn down by time, but there was something about it, something ancient that reached deep into the marrow of the earth. The building looked like it had been there forever, like it had grown from the very soil beneath it. The windows were dark, empty, reflecting nothing but the oppressive sky above. It stood tall, its spires piercing the heavens, twisted, like something you'd see in a nightmare. I parked my car, the engine dying with a soft sputter as I sat for a moment, staring at the hotel. I should have turned around. I knew it in my gut, deep down. But the exhaustion, the bone-deep kind that makes you do foolish things, pulled me toward it, and I found myself walking toward the heavy wooden doors without a second thought. The doors creaked as I pushed them open, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the vast emptiness of the lobby. It was quiet, too quiet, and the air inside felt thick, stagnant. The lobby stretched out before me, impossibly large, the floor gleaming with polished marble that reflected the dim, flickering light from overhead chandeliers. But it wasn't the kind of light you'd expect. It was too soft, too golden, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching in unnatural ways, as if the space itself were alive, watching. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence as I walked toward the front desk, my breath seeming to catch in my throat. The desk was made of polished wood, its brass fittings gleaming faintly in the muted light. And standing behind it was the bellboy, a man whose presence felt as out of place as the hotel itself. His uniform was pristine, as though it had never seen a day of wear. His eyes were dark, deep-set, and locked onto me with an unsettling intensity. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "We've been expecting you." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. How did he know my name? There was no way. I hadn't spoken to anyone here. But the fatigue, the sheer weight of it, kept my mouth shut. I could have sworn the room grew colder, the air more oppressive. but before I could speak, he slid a key across the desk toward me. 409. The key was heavy, brass, cold in my hand. I felt the weight of it, like it was something I was meant to carry, a burden that would come to bear its own consequences later. I forced a smile, though my nerves were fraying at the edges. "I just need a room for the night," I muttered, my voice unsteady. The bellboy didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just nodded. "Room 409, sir, right up this way." The key felt like ice in my palm as I turned away, my steps heavy, my mind still reeling. There was something wrong here, something that sat at the edges of my mind, tugging at me. But my exhaustion drowned out the warning bells. My tired body pulled me forward, down the long, dim hallway toward the elevator. The air grew colder with every step, the floor creaking beneath my feet, as if the building itself was sighing. I reached the elevator, its brass doors gleaming in the low light. They opened with a faint groan as I stepped inside, the mirrors reflecting only me. But something wasn't right about the reflection. The eyes staring back at me were hollow, tired. It didn't look like me at all. My heart skipped again, but the doors slid shut before I could fully process it. The elevator lurched upward, the lights flickering. The air inside was thick now, almost suffocating. It was as though the elevator was descending into some deep, hidden place within the hotel. The faint hum of machinery echoed in the stillness, and the walls seemed to close in around me with each passing floor. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal the 4th floor, and the feeling of wrongness grew deeper. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, the carpet plush underfoot, but something was off about it all. The walls seemed to close in as I walked down the hall. The portraits lining the walls, faces of men and women in old, worn frames, watched me with eyes that never seemed to blink. The lamps overhead flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to shift with every step I took. Room 409 was at the very end of the hallway, a door standing alone in the emptiness. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward it, the weight of the key heavy in my pocket. The door was a deep, dark wood, carved with intricate patterns I couldn't quite make out. I slid the key into the lock, the metallic sound loud in the silence. The door opened with a groan, and I stepped inside. The room was immaculate. Too immaculate. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn tightly shut, and the air was oddly fresh, like it had been prepared just for me. But the stillness in the room was suffocating. It felt wrong, too perfect, too quiet. My body urged me to lie down, to give in to the exhaustion that had clawed at me since the first mile of my journey. But my mind told me to leave. A low, almost imperceptible whisper broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there, just the shadows, creeping and shifting across the walls. I turned back to the door, but the instant I did, I heard the faintest footstep. Another, and then another. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped into the dim light. A woman. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, as if drained of color. Her clothes were tattered, her hair a tangled mess that fell in front of her face. She didn't move, didn't speak, she just stood there, staring at me. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. "I've been trapped here," she whispered. I thought you were the one who could help me." I froze. Help her? But the room had begun to shift. The walls groaned, the floor trembled, and the door slammed shut behind me with an unnerving force. I've been on the road for hours. The kind of trip where the scenery blurs into one long smear of gray and empty fields. just the dull hum of my tires against the pavement and the occasional flicker of my headlights illuminating the road ahead. My body aches with the strain of the drive, and my mind feels like it's about to collapse under the weight of it all. I didn't plan to stop, but fatigue has a way of making decisions for you, and that's when I saw it. A flicker of light, faint at first, barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in like an unwanted guest. A sign, the kind you wouldn't expect to see out here. Hollow Pines Hotel. It hung in the fog like some forgotten beacon, its neon lights flickering weakly as though the hotel itself was barely holding on. It should have been my first warning. But I was tired. I was desperate for rest. And so, without thinking much about it, I turned off the road and followed the gravel driveway leading up to the building. The fog swallowed everything around me. The hotel appeared through it like a shadow rising from the earth. Tall, narrow, almost impossibly so. The building looked ancient, weathered, worn, and yet still standing with a strange kind of defiance. Its windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the oppressive gray sky. The stonework of the walls was covered in creeping vines, and the spires on top seemed to pierce the heavens. It felt like the hotel had grown out of the ground itself, rooted in some long-forgotten place in time. As I parked the car and stepped out, the chill of the night air hit me like a slap. The ground was damp, the grass slick with dew, and the smell, there was something about the air here. It smelled old, like dust, decay, and something else I couldn't name, something wrong. But my exhaustion pushed that feeling aside. I needed rest. I walked toward the doors. The hotel stood in front of me, its grand entrance looming like a great, dark mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The doors were massive, dark wood, polished to a sheen. I pulled them open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the quiet like a warning bell I was too tired to hear. Inside, the lobby stretched out before me, far too large for a place like this. The floor was smooth, polished marble, and the chandeliers overhead gleamed like they had never known time. But there was a stillness in the air, an eerie, suffocating silence that pressed down on me, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shivered, but told myself it was just the cold. At the front desk stood a bellboy, immaculately dressed in a uniform that looked like it had been pulled from another era. His face was pale, his eyes dark, but they locked onto me with unnerving precision. He smiled when I approached, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone offering hospitality. It was the kind of smile you see just before a trap is sprung. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said smoothly. "We've been expecting you." I froze. How did he know my name? I had made no reservations. There was no way he should have known anything about me. But the exhaustion clouded my mind, made my thoughts slow and heavy, and I couldn't bring myself to question it. "I just need a room for the night," I managed to say. Without a word, he reached beneath the desk and pulled out a brass key. 409. The engraving was simple, elegant, and cold to the touch when he handed it to me. I felt its weight in my palm, and for the briefest of moments I thought it felt wrong. But I ignored it. My body was screaming for rest, and the hotel was silent, still, almost inviting in its ancient, crumbling grandeur. "Room 409, sir, right this way." I nodded and turned toward the elevator, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The hallway stretched out before me like some kind of endless tunnel. The paintings on the walls, old, faded portraits of people whose names had long since been forgotten, stared at me with hollow eyes. They watched me as I passed, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The air was thick now, heavier. I reached the elevator, its brass doors gleaming in the dim light. I stepped inside, and they closed behind me with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. It was the kind of elevator you don't expect to see in a modern hotel. Old-fashioned. Almost too much so. The wood paneling was faded and chipped, the brass fixtures tarnished with age. The floor was covered in a red velvet carpet that looked too plush for its own good. The light overhead flickered briefly, casting strange shadows across the walls. I was alone in the elevator, and yet the space felt crowded, as if something, or someone, was with me, lurking just out of view. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, and for a split second it looked wrong. My face was too still. My eyes seemed hollow. It was me, but it wasn't. It felt like I was staring into the face of a stranger. I quickly looked away, trying to shake the feeling, but the elevator jerked upward, throwing me off balance. The lights flickered again, the hum of the machinery deepening, the sound vibrating through my chest like some distant warning. The elevator moved slowly, and with every floor it passed, I felt like it was taking me further away from the world I knew. The hum grew louder. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. The air became thicker, colder, like I was being swallowed by the very building itself. The elevator stopped on a floor, and the doors slid open with a sound that sent a sharp chill down my spine. The hallway that stretched out before me was far too long. The carpet was deep, rich crimson, and the walls were lined with those same portraits. Faces I couldn't recognize, eyes that seemed to follow me as I stepped out. The flickering lights overhead cast long, jagged shadows, stretching unnaturally, twisting in ways that made no sense. The air was heavy with silence, too heavy. I could feel it pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. The doors behind me slid shut with a soft click, sealing me in. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing louder than the last. My breath came shallow, as if the air itself was too thick to inhale properly. The feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was waiting, had settled deep in my chest. My pulse quickened. And then, just as I reached room 409, I heard it. A soft, slow footstep behind me. Another, and another. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the long, empty hallway, the portraits on the walls, the shadows that seemed to stretch too far. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I had been driving for hours, longer than I should have. The kind of trip where you stop noticing the scenery, where the road feels endless and your mind begins to fog over. The tires of my car hummed against the pavement, a steady, rhythmic lullaby that made my eyelids heavy. I didn't plan to stop, but I was getting desperate. The exhaustion was creeping in, crawling under my skin like a constant ache. And then I saw it. Through the haze of fog that had rolled in like a thick blanket, a faint, flickering light. A sign. Hollow Pines Hotel. It appeared out of nowhere, like some half-formed thought that hadn't fully settled into my brain yet. The neon lights were barely glowing, flickering against the fog like a dying heartbeat. I should have kept driving, should have trusted that gut feeling that whispered warnings in my mind. But I didn't. I needed rest, and this place, despite the eerie, almost unreal feeling it gave off, was my only option. I pulled off the road, the gravel crunching under my tires as I made my way down a long, winding drive that seemed to stretch forever. The hotel appeared before me, towering through the mist. It was an imposing structure. Tall, narrow, its stone facade darkened by time. It looked as though it had been there forever, like it had grown out of the earth itself. The windows were dark, empty, and yet they seemed to watch me as I pulled up to the entrance. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The ground was damp beneath my boots, the grass slick with dew, and the smell. It wasn't just the scent of the earth or the trees. It was something else. Something old. Something wrong. I ignored it. The fatigue was too heavy to fight. I made my way to the doors, and when I pulled them open, they groaned on their hinges like a warning, but I didn't heed it. Inside, the lobby was vast. Too vast. The air felt thick with silence, heavy and suffocating. The floor gleamed with polished marble that reflected the dim light above, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The chandeliers hanging from the ceiling flickered, their golden light giving the room a strange, ghostly glow. The entire space felt wrong, out of place. At the front desk stood a bellboy, perfectly dressed in a uniform from another time. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and as he smiled at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to know. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice smooth, far too calm. "We've been expecting you." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't made any arrangements, but I couldn't bring myself to question it. I was too tired, too desperate for rest. "I just need a room for the night," I said, my voice sounding strangely distant. The bellboy didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just nodded, and with a practiced motion, slid a brass key across the desk. 409. The number was etched in delicate script. The key felt cold in my hand, almost like it had been sitting there for too long, waiting for me. "Room 409, sir," the bellboy said, his smile still plastered on his face. "Right up this way." I nodded numbly and turned toward the hallway, my steps heavy on the carpet as I made my way to the elevator. The silence in the lobby pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. The hotel felt like it was holding its breath. I stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed behind me with a low, grinding sound that echoed in the stillness. The elevator was old, too old for a place like this. The wood paneling was chipped and faded, the brass fixtures tarnished with age. The floor was covered with a thick, plush carpet, and the air inside felt heavier, colder, as if the space had been sealed off from everything else. The light flickered above, casting strange, jerky shadows on the walls, and the hum of the elevator's motor vibrated beneath my feet, making my bones ache. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked tired, older than it should, my eyes sunken and heavy. But there was something off about it. My reflection seemed distant somehow. It didn't look quite right. It was me, but not entirely. My eyes were too still, too hollow. I turned away quickly, but the elevator jolted, pulling my attention back. The sound of the motor deepened, and the floor beneath me seemed to shift. Each floor it passed felt like a small eternity, stretching the time between us. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, pressing against me from all sides. It was like the elevator wasn't just taking me to another floor, it was pulling me somewhere else, somewhere wrong. The elevator stopped with a sudden lurch, and the doors opened to the 4th floor. I stepped out, the hallway stretching far ahead of me, longer than it should have been. The carpet was a deep, rich crimson, muffling my footsteps as I walked down the hall. The walls were lined with portraits, the faces of men and women who looked at me with eyes that didn't blink, eyes that followed my every step. The flickering lights overhead cast shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting in ways that made no sense. The air felt heavy, thick, like it was pushing me back. The hallway was far too long, too narrow, like it was closing in on me. Room 409 was at the end, the door standing alone in the silence. I approached it, the weight of the key heavy in my pocket. I inserted the key into the lock, the brass cold against my fingers. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was immaculate. Too immaculate. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets smooth, almost too smooth, as though they had never been touched. The air was stale, but fresh at the same time, like the room hadn't been used in years, yet somehow it was ready for me. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the world outside, but I could see a faint light peeking through the edges. I moved toward the bed, my body aching for rest. As soon as I sank into the softness of the sheets, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. But it didn't last long. A whisper broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." The words were soft, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the corner of the room. My heart stopped for a beat. I looked around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The room was still, too still, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. I turned to face the corner where the whisper had come from, and that's when I saw her. A woman standing motionless, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with despair. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, her mouth slightly open as though she were about to speak. "I've been trapped here for years," she said, her voice hoarse, cracking with years of silent suffering. "You don't understand. You have to leave. This place, it won't let you go." I took a step back, my mind spinning. What was she talking about? What was this place? But before I could speak, she took a slow step toward me, her eyes wide with pleading. "Don't stay," she whispered. "You don't know what it wants." My heart raced in my chest, my breath quickening as I backed toward the door. But when I looked back, she was gone. Vanished, just as suddenly as she had appeared. I was alone. Or was I? The air in the room had changed. It felt thick now, oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, the space shrinking with every breath I took. Something wasn't right, and it was watching me. The room wasn't just a room, it was a prison. I had been driving for what felt like forever, endless miles of empty highway, the world blurring past in shades of gray. The hum of the tires beneath me was like a lullaby, and I could feel the exhaustion creeping in, thick and heavy. My body ached for rest, and my mind felt like it was drowning in a fog of fatigue. But then, through the haze, I saw it. A faint flicker of light, almost like a distant star, Hollow Pines Hotel. The sign glowed weakly, flickering through the mist that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. I wasn't planning on stopping, but I was desperate. The road stretched on, and I had no idea how much farther I could go. A place to rest, even for a few hours, seemed like a blessing. So, I turned off the highway, the gravel crunching under my tires as I followed the long, winding driveway toward the hotel. As I approached, the hotel revealed itself through the fog, towering above me like a dark, looming figure. It looked like it had been there forever, its stone walls worn and weathered, windows dark and empty, reflecting nothing but the oppressive gray sky above. The building seemed to stretch up into the clouds, its spires twisting like ancient, forgotten fingers reaching toward the heavens. There was something off about it, something unsettling that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but the exhaustion weighed too heavily on me and I ignored it. I needed to sleep. I parked my car and stepped out into the cold night air. The ground was slick with dew, the smell of damp earth hanging heavy in the air. The hotel loomed before me, the massive wooden doors standing as if they were guarding something far deeper within. The fog wrapped around the building like a living thing, and as I reached for the door, the chill in the air seemed to grow, biting at my skin. But I pushed it aside. I was too tired to care. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, the sound echoing unnervingly in the silence of the lobby. The space was vast, stretching farther than it should have. the floor gleaming with polished marble that reflected the dim light from the chandeliers above. But the light didn't seem right. It was soft, almost sickly, flickering in a way that cast strange, uneven shadows across the room. The air was thick, stale, but fresh all at once. It smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic, like the smell of blood that had been forgotten in the dark corners of time. At the front desk, there stood a bellboy, impeccably dressed in a uniform that looked far too old-fashioned for this place. His eyes were dark, and he watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He smiled as I approached, but it wasn't the kind of smile that welcomed you. It was a knowing smile, as if he knew exactly who I was, why I was there, and what would happen next. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said smoothly, his voice too calm, too perfect. "We've been expecting you." I froze. How could he possibly know my name? There was no way. I hadn't even given it to anyone. The fatigue clouded my thoughts, but the unease lingered. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss the feeling of wrongness creeping up my spine. "I just need a room for the night," I muttered, my voice shaky. He didn't flinch, he didn't seem surprised at all. Instead, he simply reached under the desk and pulled out a brass key. The number 409 was engraved in delicate script. The key felt cold against my palm as he handed it to me. "Room 409, sir. Right up this way." I nodded numbly, too tired to question anything further. I took the key and walked down the hallway toward the elevator, my steps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The flickering lights overhead cast strange shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the hallway was far too long. The portraits on the walls, faces of long-forgotten people, watched me with lifeless eyes. The more I tried to look away, the more their eyes seemed to follow. I reached the elevator, its brass doors gleaming in the dim light, and stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a soft, almost hesitant sound, as though the elevator were unsure whether it should let me in. The air inside was cold, thick with an unnatural stillness. The light flickered above me, casting shifting shadows across the small, cramped space. The elevator lurched, the floor creaking under my feet, as if the whole building were sighing beneath me. I glanced at the mirror across from me, catching a glimpse of my reflection. But it didn't look right. My face, my eyes, there was something off about them. They seemed too still, too lifeless. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper, something darker. I turned away quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The elevator continued its slow ascent, but each floor it passed felt like it was taking longer than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, pressing against me. The faint hum of the machinery beneath me reverberated through my chest, and the lights flickered again, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the walls. The elevator stopped with a sudden jolt, the doors sliding open to reveal the fourth floor. I stepped out, but the hallway stretched out before me, too long, too narrow. The air felt heavier here, thicker, like it was pressing against my lungs. The carpet was deep crimson, and the walls were lined with portraits that seemed to stare at me, their eyes empty and watchful. The flickering lights overhead did nothing to soothe the sense of unease that was rapidly growing inside me. Room 409 was at the very end of the hallway, the door standing alone in the silence. I approached it, my footsteps too loud in the stillness. The door was solid, heavy, and when I inserted the key, the lock clicked open with an unnervingly loud sound. I stepped inside. The room was too perfect, too pristine. The bed was made to military precision, the sheets smooth and white, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. The air was stale yet somehow fresh, as though it had been waiting for me. The curtains were drawn, and the light from the lamp cast long shadows across the room, but it was all wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and for a moment I swore I saw the walls pulse like they were breathing. I turned to the window, expecting to see the world outside, but instead there was nothing. No glass, no view. Just a smooth blank wall where the window should have been. I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me, but before I could process what was happening, a whisper broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but there was no one. Nothing but the room watching me. Then, from the corner, I saw her. The woman. She was standing there, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow, her lips moving but no words coming out. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, as I stared at her in disbelief. "I've been trapped here," she whispered, her voice raw, as though she hadn't spoken in years. "You have to leave." I froze. Trapped? This place? What was she talking about? But before I could speak, she took a step forward, her body shaking, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't stay, you don't understand." But as soon as she spoke, the room began to change. The walls trembled, the floor groaned beneath me, and the air grew heavier. The bed, once perfectly still, began to move, slowly shifting across the floor. The room was shifting, changing around me. And then the door. The door wasn't there anymore. It was just a wall now, smooth and seamless, as though it had never existed. The walls creaked, groaned, and then the room seemed to breathe. I was trapped. There was no escape. The room had become alive, and it was changing, shifting, pulling me in. I had been driving for hours, too many hours, the kind of trip where you lose track of time, where the endless highway stretches out before you like a ribbon of gray leading nowhere. The tires hummed beneath me, a steady, monotonous sound that matched the foggy haze slowly creeping into my mind. My body ached, my eyes stung, and the fatigue wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I needed to stop. I didn't plan to, but I was desperate for rest. And that's when I saw it. A flicker of light through the thickening fog. It was faint at first, like a distant star lost in the haze, but then it grew brighter. A neon sign that promised some sort of salvation. Hollow Pines Hotel. I couldn't say why I chose to pull off the road. Maybe I was too tired to care about the uneasy feeling that gnawed at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the allure of a place to sleep that made me ignore the odd sensation in the pit of my stomach. Whatever it was, I turned the wheel and steered toward the hotel. As I drove closer, the hotel seemed to rise out of the fog like a dark, looming presence. It was tall, its stone facade worn and weathered by time, its windows dark and empty, reflecting nothing but the gray sky above. The building seemed too old for the time and place, like it had been left here forgotten to decay. The more I looked at it, the more it felt wrong, like it was staring at me, watching me. But my tiredness pushed that thought away. I parked the car and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The ground beneath my boots was slick with dew, and the air smelled of damp earth and something off. The fog wrapped around the hotel like a living thing, and I felt a shiver race down my spine. I should have turned back. I should have gotten in my car and driven away. But I didn't. The exhaustion had a hold on me that I couldn't shake. I walked toward the doors, my footsteps heavy and deliberate, like something was pulling me toward it. The doors creaked open as I stepped inside, the sound echoing far too loudly in the stillness of the lobby. It was vast, the kind of space that felt almost too large for a place like this. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the dim light from the chandeliers above. But there was something unsettling about the light. It was soft, too soft, casting long shadows across the room. The air felt thick, stagnant, as if the place had been untouched for years. I walked toward the front desk, drawn by the strange sense of expectation in the air. Behind the desk stood a bellboy, impeccably dressed in a uniform that looked like it had been pulled from another time. His face was pale, his eyes dark and calculating, and when he smiled, it was like he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't meant to know. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said smoothly, his voice too calm, too knowing. "We've been expecting you." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken it to anyone. My mind raced, but I couldn't focus. The fatigue made it hard to think, to make sense of anything. "I just need a room for the night," I muttered, my voice hoarse. Without missing a beat, the bellboy reached beneath the desk and slid a brass key toward me. 409. The number was etched in delicate script, the key cold and heavy in my palm. "Room 409, sir. Right up this way," he said, his smile never wavering. I nodded, still dazed, and turned toward the hallway. My legs felt like lead, and I moved toward the elevator, hoping for some rest. The hallway seemed too long, the walls too silent. The portraits that lined the walls stared at me with lifeless eyes, watching me as I walked past. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows that didn't seem to belong. My heart began to race again as I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me, as if the hotel itself was alive, aware of me. The elevator was old, too old, the kind of elevator that shouldn't belong in a building like this. The doors opened with a groan, and I stepped inside. The air was colder inside, thick and suffocating. The light overhead flickered again, casting unsettling shadows in the corners of the small space. I glanced at my reflection in the mirrored walls, but the face staring back at me looked wrong. My eyes were hollow, too tired, too empty. I didn't look like myself. The elevator moved slowly, and I felt the tension in the air tighten. It was as if the building was shifting, as if it were moving along with me, adjusting to my every step. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier with each floor we passed. I could feel my chest tightening with every breath I took. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to the 4th floor. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the carpet rich and deep beneath my feet. The walls were lined with portraits, their eyes still fixed on me as I walked past, their gazes unblinking. The lights flickered once more, and the shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to move, to twist, as though they were alive. Room 409 was at the very end of the hallway. I reached the door, feeling the weight of the key in my pocket. When I inserted it into the lock, it turned with an unsettling click, the sound too loud in the silence. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was perfect. Too perfect. The bed was made to military precision, the sheets smooth and white, the furniture arranged neatly. The air smelled faintly of something floral, but there was an underlying scent of decay, like the place had been untouched for years. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the outside world, but the room was far too still. The silence was suffocating. I felt a pull to the window, my hand reaching out instinctively. But when I drew back the curtains, I froze. There was no view, no glass, just a smooth blank wall where the window should have been. I felt my breath catch in my throat. What the hell? I turned quickly, but before I could process what was happening, I heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, but there. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one in sight. The room was empty, the shadows shifting unnaturally in the corners. But then, I saw her. A woman. She was standing in the far corner of the room, her pale face gaunt, her eyes hollow. She didn't move, didn't speak at first. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I've been trapped here," she said, her voice raspy, filled with desperation. "You have to leave. You don't understand. You don't understand what this place is." I took a step back, my breath shallow. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" But before she could answer, the room shifted. The walls groaned, the floor trembled beneath my feet, and the air thickened, like the very building was coming alive around me. I turned to the door, but it wasn't there. It was just a wall now, smooth and featureless, as if the room had swallowed it whole. My pulse raced, my mind spinning. The room was changing, the walls were moving, shifting. I ran toward the corner, desperate for a way out, but the walls pressed in closer. The room was shrinking around me, the space becoming smaller, tighter, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The woman's voice echoed in my mind. "It won't let you go." I grabbed the bed frame, my fingers slipping over the wood, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The room was alive, and it was pulling me in. There was no escape. I was trapped. Trapped in this nightmare, with no way out. The hotel had claimed me, and there was nothing left to do but surrender to its hunger. But then, in the distance, I saw it. A crack in the wall, a door. I didn't question it. I didn't think. I ran toward it, my legs weak, my mind screaming for me to move, to escape. The door was just ahead. I reached for it. My hand closed around the handle, and for a moment I thought I was free. But when I yanked the door open, the hallway outside was empty, twisted, dark, and silent. I stepped through, but the air was thick, the walls closing in. There was no way out. The hotel was alive, and I was just another part of it. I don't know how long I've been driving, but it feels like forever. The endless highway stretches out before me, a blur of gray beneath the tires. The road is long, the kind that goes on and on until you lose track of time. I'm exhausted, physically drained, mentally foggy. My eyes are heavy and I can feel the pull of sleep. I never meant to stop, but I'm not sure how much farther I can go. That's when I see it. A flickering light in the distance, like a dying star in the fog. Hollow Pines Hotel. I didn't want to stop, but I needed to rest. The pull of that glowing sign, barely visible through the thickening fog, felt like an invitation. A place to sleep. The sign flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes, but no. I needed this. So, I pulled off the highway, gravel crunching beneath my tires, and followed the twisting drive up toward the hotel. When I saw it, I had my first inkling that something wasn't right. The hotel loomed ahead, dark and towering through the fog. It was old, too old for a place like this. The stone was worn and weathered, the windows dark like empty eyes staring back at me. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, like it didn't want to let me in, but I didn't care. I just needed to rest. I parked the car and stepped out into the cold night. The fog curled around me, the dampness of the earth creeping up into my bones. The air smelled wrong, damp, but with something more, something metallic. I didn't pause to question it. My exhaustion was too heavy to ignore. I moved toward the doors of the hotel, and they creaked open like a warning. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The lobby stretched out before me, vast and empty. The marble floor gleamed faintly under the dim, flickering light. The chandeliers above cast soft shadows that didn't seem right, like they were moving when they shouldn't have been. The air felt stale, like it had been trapped inside for years, and the silence, God, it was suffocating. It pressed down on me from all sides. Behind the front desk stood a bellboy. He was perfectly dressed, his uniform pristine, but his smile felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone greeting a guest. It was knowing. Cold. As if he already knew everything about me. "Welcome, Mr. Turner," he said in a low, smooth voice. "We've been expecting you." I froze. How could he possibly know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone. The fog of exhaustion clouded my mind. I couldn't think, I couldn't speak, I just nodded, hoping he'd let me be. "I just need a room for the night," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. The bellboy reached beneath the desk and pulled out a brass key, handing it to me with a steady, practiced motion. 409. The number was etched in delicate script. He didn't blink, didn't move except to slide the key into my hand. "Room 409, sir, right this way," he said, his voice never wavering, his eyes too sharp. I nodded numbly, turning toward the hallway, my feet heavy beneath me. The hallway stretched on far longer than it should have. The flickering lights overhead created long, twisting shadows that seemed to follow me as I moved. The portraits on the walls, people from another time, stared at me with empty eyes, watching me, waiting. I reached the elevator. It opened with a groan, the doors scraping against the frame. Inside, it was colder, the air thick and stifling. The light flickered above, casting warped shadows in the corner. I glanced at my reflection in the mirrored walls, but the face staring back at me didn't look right. My eyes were too hollow, too tired. I didn't recognize myself. The elevator jerked to life, and the low hum of the machinery vibrated under my feet. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thicker, suffocating. With every floor, it felt like the building was taking me deeper into itself, as if it didn't want me to leave. My heart began to race, but my exhaustion weighed me down, pulling me toward the inevitable. When the elevator stopped, I stepped out onto the 4th floor. The hallway stretched out in front of me, too long. The carpet was deep crimson beneath my feet, but the silence was so oppressive, it felt like the hallway was pulling at me, tugging at my sanity. The walls seemed to curve inward, the portraits on the walls staring at me with eyes that were too alive, too knowing. Room 409 was at the very end of the hall, the door standing alone in the silence. I walked toward it, each step heavier than the last. The key felt cold in my hand as I inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped inside. The room was immaculate. Too immaculate. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets smooth and white, the furniture arranged just so. It was too neat, too pristine. The air smelled faintly of something floral, but it was undercut with an undertone of decay, something I couldn't quite place. I walked to the window, instinctively reaching for the curtains, but when I pulled them back there was nothing. No glass, no view, just a blank, featureless wall, smooth and cold. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. And then I heard it. A whisper. So soft, I almost couldn't hear it. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, my pulse quickening. And then, from the corner of the room, there she was, a woman standing motionless. Her face pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me with a mixture of fear and something else. Desperation. I couldn't move. "I've been trapped here," she whispered, her voice raw. "You have to leave. It won't let you go." I took a step back. My legs felt like they might give way beneath me. "Who are you? What is this place?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered. "You don't understand. Don't stay. It will take you." I stumbled back, my mind racing. Before I could speak again, the room shifted. The floor trembled beneath me, the walls creaking as they moved, closing in. The bed shifted across the floor, the sheets now twisted, darker. The room began to shrink, the air growing colder. I turned toward the door, but there was no door. The wall had sealed shut, smooth and unbroken, as though the space had swallowed it whole. My heart raced as I slammed my hands against the wall, my breath ragged in my chest. No escape. And then I heard it. A low, terrifying hum. A pulse, deep and endless, like the heartbeat of the building itself. The walls began to close in on me. I was trapped. The room had swallowed me whole, and I could feel it tightening, squeezing, changing me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I turned, desperate to run, but before I could move, the woman's voice echoed in my mind. "You can't escape." The walls closed in, and everything around me warped into a dark, suffocating void. And just as I thought I was done for, I woke up. But nothing was the same. The fog outside was thicker, a sickly gray that blotted out the sun. The air was heavier, the world wrong. The windows were warped, the streets twisted in ways that made no sense. And there, standing tall and silent in the distance, was the Hollow Pines Hotel. But now I knew the truth. I never left. The hotel had let me go, but it had dragged me into something worse, a parallel world, a mirror reality. And I was trapped here forever. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.